segment of our maintenance pre-trip. You've already done the maintenance pre-trip on your 10-yard truck. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do a maintenance pre-trip on a 10-yard plow fully outfitted for winter operations. This plow truck consists of a head plow, a belly plow, wing plow, and a chain-driven sander. One of the first places to start with your maintenance pre-trip is at where the front plow meets the bumper. What we're looking for is we're making sure that the bumper is not cracked or bent, making sure all the welds are good. We're making sure that all the bumper bolts are tight. There's 5 bolts on each side, all grade 8 bolts, making sure that each one is tight and secure. We're looking down into the pocket, making sure that where the front plow hooks to the front bumper, that it's not cracked or bent, there's no broken welds. Then we're going to come out here and we're going to check the plow frame. We're making sure that the plow frame is not cracked or bent. There's no broken welds. We're checking where the main bolts are that bolt the front plow to the front bumper. There's 2 bolts, making sure they are securely fastened and tight. We're looking at our hydraulic cylinder, making sure that it's not leaking, it's not been or cracked. We're checking our hydraulic hoses, making sure that they're not cracked or frayed or leaking. We're checking all of our pins and keepers, making sure that they're all in place. Got pins down here with keepers. Move over here to the front of our plow. We've got bolts, making sure that they're not broken and tight. Checking to make sure our spring is not cracked or broke, making sure the bolts are securely fastened and tight here. We're checking our plow lift chains, making sure that the clevises and pins are in with their keepers, making sure that the plow lift chains are not stretched, cracked, or broke, making sure where the plow lift chain hooks up for the lifting arm, making sure that that's not cracked or broke. Making sure the overall backside of the plow is not cracked or bent. We're going to walk around to the front of the plow. Going to make sure that the rubber flap on the front of the plow is not cracked or torn or ripped. Then we're going to check our plow bit. You've got to check underneath to make sure your plow bits are all there. They're not cracked or broke. Make sure all the bolts are there and securely tightened. As we're coming around to this side, we're checking the plow shoe. We're making sure that this jack stand is not cracked or bent, making sure it's fully securely bolted on here. We're making sure the shoe itself is not cracked and is tight onto the jack. We're working our way over here. There's a big center bolt with a keeper pin on the back of it, making sure it is tight and securely fastened. Coming over here to our grade 5 shear pin, making sure that it is in and securely fastened. Checking the rest of the pins and keepers on this side, making sure the rest of the plow frame over here is not cracked or bent. Checking the bumper bolts. You may need a light to get in here to inside to see to make sure they are tight. This is our new slotted trip plow. If you have any questions about it, you can look at the operator's manual inside this little compartment. This plow is the newest addition to our fleet. We normally have the tension spring plow that you'll find most typically in most maintenance yards. After checking your front plow, if your truck is equipped with the belly plow, here's some things that you need to know. The belly plow has the main plow frame assembly that bolts to the frame of the truck. We're checking to make sure that there's no broken bolts. Everything's nice and tight. Checking that the plow frame assembly is not cracked or bent, that all the welds have no cracks. Making sure that this rotator stop is in here so it will not come back and get into your fuel tank. Checking to make sure that the bolts where it rotates on the plow frame assembly is nice and tight. Bolts are nice and tight. No broken, cracked welds. Checking for the hydraulic cylinder, making sure it has no leaks, it is not cracked or bent. The bolts are nice and tight. Checking the hose, hydraulic line coming in to the cylinder, making sure it's not cracked or frayed. No leaks. Coming down where the cylinder mounts to the belly plow itself, making sure that the frame is not cracked or bent. There's no broken welds. Checking to make sure the bolts are nice and tight. Checking to make sure that the belly plow itself is not cracked or bent. No broken welds. Making sure that the cutting edges are on and nice and tight. So now we're going to inspect our belly plow serrated ice bit. We're checking to make sure that we have plenty of bit left, which, as you can see here, this one has a good life of wear left into it. And you can see that we have this little old half moon. Once it gets to the top of the half moon, that will be time to change it. This one has plenty of bit left on it, so we're good to go. And when it's all good, we will move on to the other side. As you walk up to this side, you're checking the same things. We've got our stop block on this side. Got a stop block back here. We've got our hydraulic cylinder that pivots the belly plow. You're checking to make sure it is not cracked or bent, securely fastened, all bolts are tight. The hoses, making sure there's no cracked or frayed hoses, there's no leaks. Making sure that the plow bit bolts are nice and tight on this side as well. Making sure the belly plow itself is not cracked or bent. That all the bolts are nice and tight and secure. It looks good. If everything's good with the belly plow, then we move back and inspect our junior wing. One important element in any of our fleet rigs with wing plows is to make sure that you either have your hook fastened with the wing up on the side of the truck, or make sure it's on the ground before you begin your inspection. Start by checking the plow assembly where it hooks to the frame, checking to make sure it's not cracked or bent, making sure all the bolts are nice and tight, checking the hydraulic lines, making sure they're not cracked or frayed, making sure there are no leaks, checking this hydraulic cylinder, making sure that it's not cracked. The bolts are nice and tight. There's no leaks. After look back in here, you can see that there's no oil leaking out of the cylinder. We're moving out to the outside of our plow frame, making sure that our stiff arm is not cracked or bent. There's no broken welds. The bolts are nice and tight. We're checking the electrical line for the wing plow amber flashing light, making sure that it is not cracked or frayed, there's no broken wires, and making sure it is plugged in. Now that we've looked at the plow assembly where it hooks to the frame of the truck, we're going to look where the wing plow actually hooks to the plow frame assembly. We're checking this main pin back here to make sure it's in, making sure that the frame is not cracked or bent, there's no broken welds. There's a keeper bolt under here, making sure that it's nice and tight. We're coming out here to the front face of the plow, making sure that the main pivot bolt has got a castle nut, making sure it's nice and tight with its keeper. You don't want it too tight though, because then it won't let the plow move freely up and down. We're checking our plow face, making sure it's not cracked or bent. We're checking our cutting edge on our plow, making sure it's not cracked, make sure the bolts are nice and tight. With our wing plow secured against the truck, or safely on the ground before we begin our inspection. We're going to start with the plow bit. We're checking to make sure that we're not wore down past our heat dissipator line. The heat dissipators are these little triangles, which are right here. And we're looking to make sure that the bit is not wore down past these heat dissipators. Once you get down to the top of the heat dissipator right here, and as you can see, the top of the carbide right here, that's the end of the life of the bit, and it is time to change and put on a new one. This bit is just fine for service. Then we're coming to the back side of the plow, checking the D-ring where the hook for the safety latch holds it up, making sure that the safety chain is not cracked or bent, no broken weak links, making sure the hook is not broke. One thing after checking the chain and the D-ring is to make sure that the rubber bump stop is secure and in place. If that wasn't there, then the plow would actually, the arms would actually get into the side of the bed of the truck. Coming down to the arms of the plow and the hydraulic cylinder, making sure that neither one of those are cracked or bent, that the welds are nice and tight. All the bolts are nice and tight. Shear bolts are good. Checking the chain, making sure it's not cracked or broke, no weak links. Springs are not cracked or broke. The hydraulic cylinder is not cracked. Welds are good. There's no leaks. The hoses have no cuts or frays. No leaks out of those. Moving back to the butt plate. It's not cracked or bent. There's no broken welds. The bolts are nice and tight. Grade 8 bolts. And this is why we do the inspection. We actually have found a loose bolt. So now that we found this loose bolt, we need to make sure we tighten it up before we go out and plow. Okay. Now that we've made sure that the bolts are nice, tight, and secure on the butt plate, that completes the junior wing plow inspection. Next, we will move on to inspect the sander. Checking that the sander is securely fastened to the bed of the truck. We're making sure that the clevis is not cracked or broke. It is nice and tight, hooking into the binder, making sure that the chain, there's no stretched, broken, or weak links. Making sure that where it hooks into the frame of the dump bed, making sure it's not, no broken welds, it's not cracked or bent. We're moving back to the back end of the sander. We're checking where it pins into the top of the bed, looking to make sure the bolts are nice and tight. None of the metal plates are cracked or bent. There's no broken welds. Making sure that the pin and the keeper pin are nice and secure. We're coming back to the back of the sander, checking from the top, working our way back down to the bottom of the sander chute. We're making sure it's not cracked or bent. There's no broken welds. There's no loose nuts or bolts. Making sure the cable is nice and tight. Bolts are not loose. We're moving down to the deflector plates for the spinner, making sure they're not cracked or bent, that they're adjusted to the proper height, making sure the keeper pins are in. As we go through our sander inspection, people sometimes forget that we have a spinner motor, which is located right here, and our T-bars, which sling the sand out onto the highway. On our spinner motor, we're checking to make sure it's not leaking, making sure that there's no broken bolts. On the T-bars, the same thing. We're making sure that they're fastened securely to the spinner plate. There's no broken bolts, and that the T-bars are not cracked. Looks good. Now that we're done checking the spinner motor and the T-bars, now we're going to come up here and we're going to check our hydraulic hoses. We're checking our gearbox motor and our gearbox. So we're going to begin with our inspection. If you cannot see these items, it's a good idea to go ahead and wash them off so you can inspect them thoroughly. With the gearbox, we're going to start with the bolts, making sure that the gearbox has all its bolts in it, it's not cracked, and it's not leaking. Then we're going to move down here to the gearbox motor. We're going to make sure that it doesn't have any broken bolts, it's securely fastened, and that there's no cracks in the motor housing. As we come on down here to our hydraulic lines, and we've got several different lines that are going into the back of the truck, we're trying to check to make sure that these lines, there's no cuts, frays, bulges, or leaks, and that our fittings are not cracked and they're securely tightened to the motor. As we continue on with our hydraulic check, one thing that we got to check is our fittings back here, and as you can see, we have a whole bank of fittings. We're making sure that none of them are cracked, there's not leaking, and we're making sure that they're all plugged in securely. Some of the fittings are big and some of the fittings are small, as you can see here, but they're all important, and it's good to give them a thorough check to make sure none of them are cracked or leaking. As we're done with our gearbox inspection, one item that can be overlooked is our grizzlies up on top. To inspect the grizzlies, we're going to start with our 3 pins on the side. Those are hinge pins for the grizzlies to hinge up on as they open and close. With those, we're making sure that the pins are securely in place and that there's no cracked welds. As we come around to the back side of the grizzly, we're checking the hydraulic cylinders. We're making sure that the main pins are in those with the cotter pins in place. And we're also inspecting our hydraulic hoses to make sure there's no cuts, frays, or any leaks coming out of the hose or the hose fittings. And this is done on the front as well. After checking some of the back end parts of a sander, some sanders are equipped with a pre-wet system. In the pre-wet system, we're checking to make sure that the tanks are securely mounted. We're checking to make sure the hoses have no cuts or frays, making sure they're nice and tight, making sure there's no leaks. Also, this sanding unit is a heated sander. We're checking to make sure the clamps are tight, none of the exhaust pipes are broken, there's no soot trails. And perhaps the most important thing you need to do is make sure that your spinner and your chain is operating correctly. The reason that you want to check to make sure your sander chain and your spinner is operating correctly before you load it full of sand is if it's not, and there's a problem with it, you'll have to unload the sander by hand, which is not any fun. So we're going to check our chain and spinner to make sure it's working properly before we load it with sand. We'll do this by pushing this button, and that will make the chain and the spinner both in operation. After you've checked your sander and completed the maintenance pre-trip on that, it's always a good thing to make sure all your work lights, roto beams, wing lights, and your front plow lights are all in operation before you go on the road. After your inspection is complete, you're ready to get in your rig and go plow snow. Earlier we just took a look at a slotted trip plow. Now we're going to look at ODOT's more traditional plows that we have mostly in our fleet. This is a spring tension plow. Inspection on this plow is going to be similar to the other one, but there is some differences. Earlier we were talking about the bumper, making sure the bumper bolts were tight, there was no cracks in the bumper, no broken welds. On this truck we actually did find a broken weld right here, and it is missing some bolts, as you can see. This is loose, so we need to get this repaired, get the crack welded, put some bolts back in it, and we could go on with our day. Just like the other plow, this one has the pins and the little keeper bolts. We're checking for those, making sure all the pins are secure and tight with the keeper bolts. We're checking the main plow frame. We're making sure that there's no cracks in the welds. The plow frame is not cracked or bent. We're checking our chains to make sure that they are tight. There's no weak links in this. As you can see right here, we do show a little wear in our plow lift chain. A person would want to keep a good eye on that to make sure that it doesn't break while you're out plowing. We're going to come down here to our main pivot bolt. We're going to make sure that it is nice and tight. It's got the double nut with the lock nut. It is secure. We're checking to make sure that all of our springs are not cracked or broke, making sure all the bolts are tight, making sure that where the springs attach on both ends of the plow frame and the actual plow itself, that the spring mounts are not cracked, they're not broke. We're making sure that the bolts and the mounts are good and secure. There's no broken welds. The keeper pins are in the end of the pins to where they're nice and secure. If these pins are missing, you'll have to get with your mechanic and have them fix the problem immediately before you can leave the shop. If you were to find that a spring was broken and you're unfamiliar with how to do it, get a hold of your mechanic or a person off your crew that's been properly trained to do this. Do not attempt to do these springs by yourself if you do not know what's going on with them. Just like with the other plow, we're checking the hydraulic cylinder, making sure it's not cracked or leaking, making sure the bolts are nice and tight and secure, making sure the hoses are not cracked or frayed and leaking. We're also checking these two main bolts that bolt the plow to the front of the plow truck bumper. Making sure it's nice and tight. There is two, one on each side. Now we're going to walk around to the front of the plow. We're going to check to make sure that the rubber flap is on, that the bolts are tight, it's not cut or torn. Got a little tear there, but nothing that would stop us from going out and operating. Coming around to this side, we're checking our plow, making sure that our plow bits are not cracked. We're making sure that we have enough plow bit left that we're not wearing into the bottom of the moldboard of the plow. Everything looks nice and tight. No cracks, no bends, no broken welds. After we've checked the moldboard and everything looks good to go, we've completed the pre-trip on the spring tension plow. Now we'll be going back to the traditional wing plow. As we move around the truck, now we're going to do our maintenance pre-trip on the wing. We're going to start by checking where the parallelogram attaches to the frame. If you find that it will not go down, come back here and you'll find this little pin. It's probably locked. Pull the pin out and then it will drop down. You're checking to make sure that there's no cracks or bends in the metal, making sure all the welds, there's no cracks in those. You're making sure all the bolts are tight where the parallelogram mounts to the frame. You're checking all the pins in the parallelogram, making sure that they're in place, not broken. They have their keeper bolts in. You're checking your hydraulic cylinders. There's one down in here. We're checking this hydraulic cylinder that's tucked in, making sure it's not cracked or bent, making sure the bolt is nice and tight. We're going to be coming out to this hydraulic cylinder, making sure it's not cracked or bent either, making sure the bolt on each end is nice and tight, making sure the hoses are not cracked or frayed, there's no leaks. Also, we want to make sure that we check the swivel piece here as well. We want to make sure that the swivel is not cracked or bent, there's no broken welds, making sure that the keeper pin is in, nice and tight. There's no play in the swivel. We're moving down here to the outer edge of the parallelogram, checking it to make sure it's not cracked or bent. This is where the plow actually hooks to the parallelogram. This is the pivot bolt. making sure that none of this is cracked. There's no broken welds. We're coming into the pivot bolt. We're making sure it's nice and tight. It has the castle nut and the keeper bolt, and it's nice and tight. Making sure that there's no cracks in the welds here. We're going to work our way up the face of the plow. We're making sure that it's not bent or cracked, that there's no broken welds. We're making sure that our plow bit is not cracked or bent, making sure that the bolts are nice and tight. Coming back up here to this end of it, you can see where we've got the plow moldboard and then we've got the plow bits. We're making sure that we have plenty of wear surface so we're not wearing into the moldboard of the plow. Now we're coming around here, we're making sure that our bump stop is on securely. It's nice and tight, bolted into the side of the dump bed. We're coming over here, we're making sure that our safety chain there's no weak links and that it's nice and secure. Where it's hooked into the side of the bed, making sure there's no cracks in the welds. Checking the loop where you hook the safety chain on the plow, that it's not bent or cracked, no broken welds. Making sure the safety hook itself is not cracked or bent. Then we're coming out to the outside of the plow, coming into where the stiff arm hooks into, making sure that all the nut bolts are nice and tight, the pins are in, the keeper bolt pins are in. Checking the stiff arm itself, making sure it's not cracked or bent, making sure the spring is in good condition, making sure that the grade 5 shear bolt is in place. Coming back down into the back of the butt plate of the truck, we're making sure that the bolt is nice and tight, that it's not cracked or bent, no broken welds, making sure the pin and the keeper pin is nice and tight. We're coming in to check the back of the butt plate where it's hooked into the back of the truck. We're making sure that it is not cracked or bent, that all the welds are not cracked. We're also coming back into here. This truck's a little different than the one we shot earlier. This one has a little stiff arm with some bolts. We're making sure that the bolts are nice and tight and that that piece is not cracked or bent as well. Coming around here, making sure that the bolts are nice and tight on the butt plate as well. Now we come around the sander chute and we have one more bolt to check on the butt plate, which is right in here, and it is nice and tight. After you've completed your maintenance pre-trip on your front plow and your side wing, you are ready to go.